A deputy escorts the family dog, who gets loose for a moment. It retreats under police tape, back to the front porch. But the dog can't stay here anymore. The empty house is now a crime scene. The Will County Sheriff's Office says deputies were called to the house on East Norway Trail in Crete about 2 a.m. Inside, they found the bodies of 3 family members, a 55-year-old man, a 54-year-old woman, and their 32-year-old son. Investigators say a 30-year-old woman fled the scene. She was found in Indiana, where she's from, and was taken into custody. Deputies call her a person of interest, and charges are pending. Neighbors who knew the family well called them wonderful people. They say this news is devastating. An outreach team that responds to incidents of domestic violence knocked on neighbors' doors and offered support.
It's real heavy. You never know what someone is going through. You know, when you see them, they're smiling at you. When the door's shut, you just don't know what's going on in the home. So it's just, it can happen to anyone. So I'm hoping to be there and put our organization out there to assist.
At 2:00 in the morning, most neighborhoods are asleep. Streetlights hum. Curtains don't move. And if a phone rings at that hour, it usually means one thing: something is wrong. In a quiet part of Illinois, in Crete Township, that call led deputies to a house for what sounded like a simple welfare check. A concerned family member wanted police to make sure everyone inside was okay. No sirens racing down the road. No warning to the neighborhood. Just a patrol car pulling up in the dark, expecting maybe a disagreement, maybe someone not answering their phone, maybe nothing at all. But when deputies arrived, the night changed. In the driveway sat a car, and inside that car was a man, 32-year-old Jacob Lambert, dead. Then deputies moved toward the front door, and on the first floor of the home, near the entrance, they found 2 more bodies. Jacob's parents, 54-year-old Stacy Forde and 55-year-old Patrick Forde. 3 people, 1 property, 1 night. And the first question investigators had to answer was the simplest and the most chilling. Was this random, or was this personal? Very quickly, authorities said the case looked targeted. Not a break-in, not a stranger passing through, something more direct, something that pointed to someone who knew exactly who they were looking for and exactly where to find them. Within hours, attention turned to one person, a 30-year-old woman named Jenna Strouble from St. John, Indiana. The sheriff's office said she shared children with Jacob and that their relationship was on and off. And then came the detail that snapped this story into a different category entirely. Investigators say that during interviews, Strouble made incriminating statements after the homicides. Incriminating statements. That phrase is heavy because it suggests something more than suspicion. It suggests the investigation didn't just stumble onto a lead. It found a door, and someone opened it from the inside. Authorities also said a firearm was recovered, and investigators determined it matched the one used in the killings. And if that is true, if the weapon and the statements align, then this case becomes a straight line from the driveway to the front door, to the person detectives say fled across state lines afterward. Because police say that after the incident, Strouble allegedly went back to her home in St. John, Indiana, about 8 miles away, not across the country, not a long escape, just a short distance, close enough to feel like the edges of 2 worlds touching. Illinois on one side, Indiana on the other, and somewhere between them, a crime scene that started with a welfare check and ended with 3 deaths. By Tuesday, March 24, the Will County Sheriff's Office announced that Jenna Strouble had been arrested. Not on 1 count, not on 3, but on 9 counts of first-degree murder. That number alone tells you prosecutors believe this case has layers, different legal theories, different angles, different ways to explain what happened and why it happened. And right now, she remains in custody at the Lake County Jail in Indiana, awaiting extradition back to Illinois. But here's the part that keeps investigators, and the people following this case, locked in the same haunting loop. What exactly happened in the hours before that 2 a.m. welfare check? What made a family member so worried they called police? What was unfolding behind those walls that no one outside could see? And if this was targeted, as detectives say, what was the target? Was it Jacob? Was it his parents? Was it the home itself? Or was it the relationship that connected them all, children, history, arguments, reconciliations, and whatever finally pushed this situation into violence? Because the most frightening crimes are not always the ones committed by strangers. Sometimes the most terrifying threat is the person who already knows your name, knows your schedule, knows your driveway, and knows the exact door to walk through. This is a developing case. Allegations are not convictions, and a court will decide what is proven and what is not. But what we do know is this. 3 people were found dead in Crete Township, Illinois. A mother of children connected to that family was arrested the next day. Investigators say the incident was targeted. They say she made incriminating statements. And they say a recovered firearm matched the weapon used. Now the case moves into its next and most important stage, where every claim will be tested, every timeline will be examined, and every detail will matter. So before we go further, drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? And do you think cases like this are solved by speed or by patience? Because in this story, the answer may come down to what happened in the darkest window of the night, when a welfare check became a crime scene, and a family became 3 names in a coroner's report. When investigators stepped into that first morning after the discovery, they weren't looking at a mystery in the usual sense. Not the kind where you spend days asking, who could have done this? They were looking at a scene that, in their view, already carried a message. This wasn't random. This wasn't someone drifting through the area looking for a chance victim. The way the victims were found, 1 in the driveway, 2 just inside the home, immediately shaped the questions detectives would ask next. Not who first, but how did this unfold? Because sequence matters. Sequence tells you what was planned, what was improvised, and what went wrong. And the first thing deputies had to do was lock the place down. They needed to preserve the driveway, the car, the path to the front door, the space inside the home. In cases like this, every small thing becomes a clock. A shoe mark can be a timeline. A door position can be a sentence. A phone that's missing can be a motive. Even the quiet can be evidence, because quiet is what remains after someone tries to erase their tracks. Inside that house and around that driveway, detectives would have been thinking about the most basic realities of violence: time, movement, and access. How quickly can a person move from the driveway to the front door? If someone arrived and something erupted outside first, what made it spill inside? If the first death happened in the driveway area, did the person who did it then enter the home, or were they already there? That's not speculation. It's the kind of step-by-step logic investigators use to understand what they're looking at before they ever assign blame to a name. Then the case got its first hard anchor. A welfare check wasn't something police created on their own. Someone asked for it. That person, described as a concerned family member, became one of the most important early voices in the case. Not because they were a suspect, but because they might hold the first clue about what the family was dealing with before police showed up. A welfare check usually comes after unanswered calls, no response to texts, a sudden silence that feels wrong. Sometimes it comes after an argument, a threat, a breakup, or a promise to return that never happened. So investigators would have asked, what did that family member hear? When was the last contact? Was anyone afraid? Was someone expected to be at that house? Did something happen the day before that made the silence feel dangerous? That's where the case began to narrow, because when a crime is truly random, you often start with a wide field. But when a case appears personal, you start with a circle: family, relationships, conflicts, history, the people who had access without needing to force anything, the people who could show up without raising alarms because their presence would make sense. And that's when the name came into view: Jenna Strouble. To investigators, she wasn't just a suspect. She was connected by the strongest kind of thread in any domestic case: children. Reports said she and Jacob Lambert shared kids and had an on and off relationship. That one phrase, on and off, can hold a lot. It can mean love and resentment living side by side. It can mean a breakup that never truly ends. It can mean arguments that cool down, then flare back up. It can mean custody pressure, money pressure, jealousy pressure, and the kind of emotional exhaustion where every small thing feels like the final thing. And still, none of that is proof of a crime. But it is the first map detectives draw. Because if a scene looks targeted, they look for who had a reason to target it. If it looks like someone knew the residents, they look for who knew them best. If it looks like the person moved with familiarity, they look for who would feel confident at that home, at that hour. At this stage, investigators don't get to be poetic. They have to be practical. They build a timeline. They gather phones. They collect surveillance footage if any exists from neighbors, streets, or nearby businesses. They confirm who lives there. They confirm what cars belong there. They talk to neighbors not for gossip but for patterns. Did anyone see a vehicle arriving? Did anyone hear anything strange? Did anyone see someone walking away? Did a dog bark for too long? Was there a sudden engine start, a car door slam? While that work was unfolding, law enforcement made a key statement that signaled how quickly the case was moving. They said Strouble gave incriminating statements during interviews. Incriminating statements can mean many things, and investigators often choose their words carefully. It doesn't automatically mean a full confession. It can mean contradictions. It can mean admissions that place someone at the scene when they first denied being there. It can mean a story that changes in ways that don't match evidence. It can mean details only the person involved would know. It can even mean attempts to explain that create new problems. What matters is that the sheriff's office publicly felt confident enough to say the interviews produced something damaging. And not only that, they said a firearm was recovered and determined to match the one used in the homicides. Those are the two pillars that hold up a fast-moving arrest in a major case: words and objects. Statements and a weapon. In a courtroom, both will be challenged. Defense attorneys attack statements by asking how they were obtained and what exactly was said. They attack weapon evidence by demanding the chain of custody, the lab procedures, the testing methods, the full reports. But for investigators, that combination is often what changes a case from "we think" to "we're acting now." Because time also matters in another way. When police believe a suspect may flee, destroy evidence, or harm themselves or others, the timeline tightens. It becomes less about waiting for perfect and more about securing what's available. Authorities said Strouble allegedly went back to her home in St. John, Indiana after the incident. That detail is chilling because it's not a long distance. It's close. It's near enough that a person could move from one state to another quickly and still feel like they're in the same world. But crossing state lines, even by a few miles, changes the logistics of an investigation. Agencies have to coordinate. Arrest teams have to move. Jurisdictions have to work together. One set of deputies can't simply walk into another state and do whatever they want. They need cooperation. And they got it. The sheriff's office specifically thanked the St. John Police Department and the Lake County Sheriff's Office in Indiana for quick help. That tells you what likely happened behind the scenes. Calls made early, information shared fast, officers positioned at an address, and a decision made to take her into custody before anything could shift. Now step back for a moment and understand what that speed suggests. A triple homicide does not usually end with an arrest the next day unless police believe they have strong early indicators. It doesn't mean the case is done. It means they think the foundation is strong enough to hold the first and most important step, charging someone. And they didn't just charge her lightly. They charged her with 9 counts of first-degree murder. That number is not random. It often reflects how prosecutors prepare for every legal path. Multiple counts can be filed per victim to cover different theories: intentional killing, felony murder, or other statutory approaches. It's a way of saying, we are not showing up with one narrow argument. We are showing up ready for all the ways this could be argued. But if you're watching this case as a viewer, a creator, or a human being trying to understand the story, the numbers and charges aren't the only thing that sticks. What sticks is the unanswered emotional question behind the legal one. How does a relationship tied together by children end up connected to the worst kind of outcome? This is where true crime becomes dangerous if you're careless, because the internet always tries to fill silence with guesses. People take a few facts and build full stories around them. They invent motives. They pick a villain. They decide guilt before a courtroom ever speaks. But responsible storytelling doesn't do that. Responsible storytelling holds the line. These are allegations, and the court process is where truth is tested. So what can we say without guessing? We can say investigators believe this was targeted. We can say the location matters. The The victims were all tied to the same property. We can say timing matters. A welfare check at 2 a.m. suggests unusual concern. We can say the relationship connection matters. Strouble and Lambert shared children and had an on and off relationship. We can say law enforcement says there were incriminating statements and a firearm match. And we can say this: the next phase of the story is not about sirens and search lights. It's about paperwork, hearings, extradition, and evidence. Because once a suspect is held in one state and charged in another, the machine turns slowly but steadily. Extradition is the bridge. She stays in custody while officials arrange for her to be transferred back to Illinois. Then comes the early court process: first appearances, bond decisions, formal reading of charges, and the moment where prosecutors start showing what they have, at least enough to justify holding someone. And that's where the case will either harden or start to reveal cracks. Because every big case has a public version and a courtroom version. The public version is made of headlines, targeted, incriminating statements, matching firearm, 9 counts. The courtroom version is made of details, timestamps, phone pings, witness statements, receipts, surveillance angles, lab reports, and every inconsistency. And somewhere in that courtroom version is the answer to the question people keep circling back to, quietly, even if they don't say it out loud. What happened in the hours before that welfare check? What led to that driveway? What led to that front door? And what will the evidence show when it's finally placed under a microscope? That's where we go next. By the time the arrest was announced publicly, investigators had already crossed the most delicate line in any major case. They had shifted from collecting pieces to building a narrative that could survive scrutiny. That doesn't mean the story was complete. It means law enforcement believed the early evidence was strong enough to put a name to the allegations and commit to a direction. But here is what many people don't realize about cases like this. The arrest is not the finish line. It's the moment the case becomes a contest between two versions of reality, the one the state thinks it can prove, and the one the defense will fight to replace it with. And the battleground is evidence. The moment a suspect is taken into custody, the investigation doesn't stop. It expands. Detectives now have to justify every decision they made. They have to preserve every step, every interview, every recovered item, every handoff between agencies. Because a triple homicide case draws pressure from every direction: the grieving families, the community, the media, and the court itself. So while the public saw a few key facts, investigators were working through the parts that rarely make headlines but decide everything later: timelines, movements, digital traces, and motive patterns, without ever calling it motive too early. The starting point for that deeper phase is often the most ordinary thing in the world: the phone. In almost every modern case, your phone becomes a silent witness. It tracks where you were. It shows who you talked to. It reveals the last message you sent. It logs your searches, your maps, your calls, your missed calls. Even when you think you've deleted something, a record often exists somewhere, on a server, in a backup, in a carrier log, in a cloud account. So the questions investigators would be asking behind the scenes are not dramatic. They are specific. Where was Jacob's phone last active? Where was Jenna's phone in the hours surrounding the incident? Did either device travel from Illinois to Indiana afterward? What about messages between them? Were there recent arguments, demands, threats, apologies, silence? And then there's the question that connects directly back to why a welfare check happened in the first place. Was there a final attempt to reach someone that failed? A call that went unanswered that felt unusual enough to alarm a family member? That welfare check request is the kind of detail that can quietly shape an entire case because it creates a timestamp, a moment when someone realized something was wrong. And if investigators can determine what triggered that moment, whether it was lack of contact, a missed pickup, a conflict, or a plan that never happened, it becomes part of the timeline that prosecutors will later lean on. At the same time, investigators would be building a physical map. Not a dramatic map with arrows and music, but a simple one: points of contact and distance. The home in Crete Township, the driveway, the front door, the car, the route to St. John, Indiana, the time it takes to make that trip, the stops along the way, the cameras that might have captured a car passing by at certain intersections. That's why the sheriff's office thanking Indiana agencies matters. When a case stretches across state lines, even by a short distance, coordination becomes essential. Because one of the most powerful types of evidence in a modern case is surveillance. Traffic cameras, business cameras, neighborhood cameras, license plate readers, toll records. A person doesn't need to be followed by police for their movement to be documented. Cameras do it automatically. And if investigators believed Strouble traveled from the crime scene area back to her residence after the incident, then the question becomes, can they trace that path? Can they place her vehicle, or a vehicle tied to her, on that route at a relevant time? That's often where the case either strengthens or weakens. If the route evidence aligns, prosecutors gain confidence. If it doesn't, defense attorneys gain leverage. But remember, we do not have those details publicly yet. We only know what law enforcement stated generally, that she allegedly fled back to Indiana and was arrested there. Next comes the weapon issue. A firearm being recovered and said to match the one used is a major claim. It suggests investigators believe they have both the object and a forensic connection to the crime. How do they determine that match? Typically, through ballistics comparisons, examining markings on bullets and cartridge casings to see whether they are consistent with a particular gun. In court, that process will be dissected. Defense attorneys may question the testing method, the lab procedure, the chain of custody, and the certainty of the conclusion. Prosecutors will rely on trained examiners and reports. The public sees only one line. It matched. In court, that one line becomes a thick stack of documents and testimony. But there's something else that matters just as much as the weapon: how it was found. Was it recovered from a vehicle, a home? Was it voluntarily surrendered, discovered during a search, found because of information from an interview? Those details matter because the defense will later examine whether the search was lawful and whether the evidence should be allowed in court. And then we return to the phrase that keeps repeating in this case, not in our narration, but in the official statement: incriminating statements. If there is a single component that can either become a prosecutor's centerpiece or a defense attorney's target, it's that. Statements can be powerful. They can also be complicated. If someone speaks without a lawyer, the defense might argue they were overwhelmed or confused. If someone spoke after a long interview, defense might question the conditions. If someone made partial admissions, defense might argue they were taken out of context. If the statements were recorded, prosecutors can play them. If they were not recorded, it becomes a credibility battle between what an investigator says was said and what the defendant claims was meant. So by the time this case enters court, one of the earliest and biggest fights could be about what exactly was said in those interviews, and whether those words truly connect Strouble to what happened in Crete Township, or whether they can be explained another way. Now, step away from procedure and consider the human frame of this case, because it's not just a list of legal events. This is the collapse of a family structure with children at its center. Authorities said Strouble and Lambert shared children. That means there are kids who will eventually grow up and hear the words triple homicide linked to their parents and grandparents. It means custody issues, family tensions, and interpersonal history could all become part of what investigators look at, carefully and privately. It also means the court will treat certain information with extra caution, because children are involved, and because family court records and juvenile details can be sealed or protected. So while the public might crave every detail, the official record may reveal less than expected in the early stages. In the background, another process begins. Detectives build witness lists. That includes neighbors, relatives, coworkers, people who last saw any of the victims, and anyone who might have seen Strouble or Lambert before the incident. In cases involving an on-and-off relationship, investigators often look for patterns: prior disputes, protective orders, past police calls, or documented incidents that show escalating conflict. And local reporting has hinted that there may have been prior law enforcement involvement connected to domestic issues in the past. That does not prove guilt. It simply suggests this situation may not have been new, and investigators will try to understand whether there was a known history that contextualizes the alleged events. Then comes extradition. At the time the sheriff's office statement was circulating, Strouble was reported to be held in Indiana, awaiting extradition back to Illinois. Extradition is a legal handoff. It's the system making sure someone charged in one state can be brought to face those charges from another state. It can happen quickly. It can also take time depending on legal steps, but its significance is simple. Once she is in Illinois, the court process starts moving in a public way. Hearings become scheduled. Lawyers appear. Arguments start. And once lawyers are in place, the flow of information changes. Because after arrest and charging, defense counsel typically advises the accused not to speak. Investigators can no longer count on voluntary interviews, so they rely more heavily on evidence that exists outside of any statement: digital records, forensic findings, witness observations, and documentation. And that's where this case may become even more intense, because it is one thing to say an incident was targeted. It is another to prove exactly how it was targeted, why the victims were positioned where they were found, and what the alleged sequence was. Prosecutors will need a story that accounts for how Strouble allegedly arrived or interacted with the victims, what happened first and where, how the scene unfolded from outside to inside, how the incident ended, and how she allegedly traveled to Indiana afterward. Defense will not only challenge that story, they may offer a different one. They might suggest that evidence is being interpreted incorrectly, that statements were misunderstood, that assumptions about movement are wrong, or that the state cannot prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. So even with the arrest, the most important stage is still ahead. And this is why cases like this hold people's attention, because what seems clear on day 1 becomes complicated by day 30. And the public only sees part of that complexity. Behind the scenes, investigators will be doing something very specific right now. They will be working to make sure the case does not depend on just one pillar. Not just the weapon, not just statements, not just the relationship. They will be looking for corroboration, evidence that connects multiple points together so tightly that pulling one doesn't collapse the entire structure. Because if a case rests on a single major claim, it can become vulnerable. But if the case rests on a web phone data supporting movement, witness accounts supporting timing, forensic matches supporting weapon use, and consistent statements supporting motive, then it becomes much harder to shake. And that brings us to the next question that hangs over everything in this investigation. What is the full timeline leading up to that night? Because somewhere in the days and weeks before this happened, there may have been warning signs, tension, disputes, a breaking point, or a sudden event that set things off. Investigators will try to reconstruct that story carefully through messages, calls, records, and witnesses until the timeline is no longer a guess. It becomes a document. And when that document finally reaches court, it will answer the one question that the community keeps circling, even when they don't say it out loud. How does an on and off relationship turn into a targeted incident that ends with 3 deaths? Once a case like this moves past the arrest announcement, the story quietly changes shape. The flashing lights fade from the headlines, and the spotlight turns to a slower place. Courtrooms, paperwork, legal deadlines, and the careful way evidence is handled when everything is on the line. And that shift is where many true crime stories either fall apart or become clearer than ever. Because in the next phase, it's no longer about what people think happened. It becomes about what can be proven, what can be challenged, and what details stand up when both sides are forced to show their work. The first major step is the transfer back to Illinois. Authorities said Strouble was being held in Indiana until extradition. In simple terms, extradition is the legal process that allows one state to bring a person back to face charges in another state. It sounds straightforward, but it matters because it is the bridge between arrested and in court. Once she is in Illinois, the case enters the early court stages where the rules of silence begin. If she has not already secured an attorney, one will be appointed or hired. And from that moment on, every word becomes strategy. People stop talking freely. Investigators stop getting casual answers. Public statements become limited, and the case becomes a slow reveal. One of the first things that typically happens is a formal appearance where the charges are presented, and the judge addresses whether the person will remain in custody. In a case involving a triple homicide and multiple counts of first-degree murder, The question of release is usually not a real one. The focus becomes procedure, confirming identity, confirming representation, setting future dates, and beginning the process where prosecutors must start turning over information. This is where 9 counts becomes more than a number. It becomes a signal. Prosecutors do not file that many counts in a case like this casually. It often means they are preparing for multiple angles of proof. If one count becomes vulnerable, another may still survive. It's a way of building redundancy in a serious case, especially early on when evidence is still being processed. And evidence is still being processed. That's another thing the public often misses. When bodies are discovered, the scene is only the beginning. Autopsies may be performed quickly, but final reports can take time. Toxicology takes time. Lab analysis takes time. Digital downloads and phone extractions take time. If there is ballistic evidence, the work does not end at "we found a gun." It continues into the technical question. How strong is the match? How well is it documented? And how clearly can an examiner explain it to a jury? Which brings us to the first big thing that usually happens behind the scenes after an arrest: preservation orders and search warrants. Prosecutors and detectives work to secure the devices and accounts connected to the people involved: phones, cloud backups, social media logs, messaging apps. If a relationship is described as on and off, investigators will often search for the last stretch of communication leading up to the incident. The words exchanged in the hours before, the days before, and the weeks before can provide something that a crime scene cannot: context. But the key is that context still has to connect to action. In court, prosecutors can't simply say, "they fought," or "there was tension." They have to prove the specific acts tied to the crime. So what they hunt for are things that close the gap between emotion and evidence. Threats, planning language, references to the location, references to a weapon, sudden travel, deleted messages, unusual searches, changes in routine. And then there is the timeline. This case has a timestamp that anchors everything: the 2 a.m. welfare check. That time is not the start of the incident. It is the moment the incident was discovered. Prosecutors will want to establish the time window in which the killings likely happened, and then show how the suspect fits inside that window. This is where the simplest facts become critical. How late was anyone last heard from? When was the last message sent? When did the concerned family member start to worry? When did they decide to call police? Were there any neighbors who heard anything earlier than 2 a.m.? Is there any camera footage that shows a vehicle arriving or leaving? Those details may exist, but they are not always revealed early. Sometimes prosecutors hold back specifics to protect witnesses or because evidence is still being verified. Other times, they reveal enough to justify detention and to show a judge that the charges are not based on guesswork. Now, there's another part of this case that has enormous legal weight: the statement about incriminating statements. If prosecutors intend to use those statements in court, the defense will likely challenge them. And one of the earliest hearings in cases like this can revolve around whether statements are admissible. Was the suspect properly advised of rights? Was the interview voluntary? Was it recorded? Were there promises made? Were there conditions that could be argued as coercive? That doesn't mean the statements are invalid. It means they will be examined. And the stronger the statements are, the harder the defense will fight to limit them or exclude them. That's why prosecutors typically do not want to rely on statements alone. They want independent proof. And that leads us to the other major public claim. A firearm was recovered and said to match the one used in the killings. A weapon match is powerful, but it has layers too. The court will care about 3 big categories. First, the forensic connection. How was the match determined? Who did the testing? What standard did the lab use? How certain is the conclusion? Is it presented as a match or consistent with or cannot be excluded? Those words matter and juries notice them. Second, chain of custody. From the moment the firearm was recovered, who handled it? How was it stored? How was it logged? Was it ever left unsecured? Was there any gap that the defense can exploit? Third, legality of the recovery. How did investigators obtain the firearm? If it was seized during a lawful search, prosecutors will show the warrant or the legal basis. If it was surrendered or found in plain view, they will document that. Defense will examine every step because if a court finds the search unlawful, key evidence can be suppressed. Now we come to the hardest part of this case, the part that doesn't sit neatly in legal language: children. Authorities said Strouble and Lambert shared children. That means there are people tied to this story who are not part of the courtroom battle but are deeply affected by its outcome. In family-linked cases, courts and investigators can be careful about what is released publicly. Some details may never become public at all, especially if they involve child custody records or sensitive family matters. But the existence of children also often influences investigative priorities. It makes safety and placement immediate. It can shape who speaks to law enforcement and when. It can shape how family members cooperate. It can also heighten tensions because grief doesn't exist alone. It collides with practical questions. Who will raise the kids? Who will be responsible? What will be the long-term impact? Those questions are outside the trial, but they surround it like a storm. And then there is the community response. When law enforcement describes an incident as targeted, they are also trying to tell the public that there is no random threat. It's a way of calming fear, but it does not calm curiosity. People still want to understand why and how. They look for patterns. They look for prior reports. They look for warning signs. Sometimes, media reporting uncovers prior law enforcement calls connected to domestic disputes, mental health intervention, or conflict. Those details can add context, but they can also mislead if people treat them as proof of what happened on this specific night. In court, prior incidents may not even be allowed unless they meet legal standards for relevance. So responsible storytelling has to hold a boundary. Context is not conviction. And now, here is what the case must answer if it is going to move from allegations to proof. 1. Presence. Can prosecutors place Strouble at or near the scene during the relevant window? 2. Sequence. Can they explain how the incident unfolded from the driveway to inside the home in a coherent way? 3. Connection. Can they tie the recovered firearm to her control or possession in a way that cannot be explained away? 4. Intent. First-degree murder charges are not just about causing death. They are about mental state, planning, and intention under the law. Prosecutors will have to prove more than a relationship. They will need evidence that supports intent. 5. Flight. Authorities said she allegedly returned to Indiana after the incident. If prosecutors can prove rapid movement away from the scene, they may argue consciousness of guilt. Defense may argue there are innocent explanations. But the point is, the travel becomes part of the case narrative, and it will be argued in court. That is how a trial is built, not from one dramatic moment, but from many small proofs that connect. And if you're watching this story unfold as a viewer, there's another truth you should remember. Early headlines are often simple, but the truth is often detailed. Over the coming weeks and months, we may learn more through court filings, hearings, and evidence summaries. We may learn whether there was surveillance footage. We may learn whether there were text messages that show escalation. We may learn whether there were forensic traces that confirm movement or contact. We may learn whether the weapon evidence is straightforward or contested. We may learn whether the timeline is tight or uncertain. And if the state's case is strong, the pressure will shift toward plea negotiations. If it's not strong, the pressure will shift toward pretrial battles where evidence is challenged and narrowed. Either way, the next big story beat will not be a dramatic chase. It will be a document, a hearing, a motion, a piece of evidence described for the first time in open court. Because that's where cases like this either lock into clarity or reveal complexity that the early headlines never showed. 3 people are gone. A family has been cut in half. And now the justice system has one job: to take what is alleged, separate it from rumor, and decide what is proven. And if you're following this case for facts, not noise, stay close to the timeline. Watch what evidence gets filed. Watch what gets challenged. Watch what survives. Because in the end, it won't be the loudest theory that wins. It will be the strongest proof. Before we close this story, tell me in the comments, what do you think matters most in a case like this? Statements, forensics, or digital evidence? And if you want follow-ups the moment court documents reveal something new, subscribe to Global Crime Facts and turn on notifications.